In the past, I did a number of videos talking about my own philosophical development, and a lot of these centered around what I call phases, where I was like super into this kind of thing for a while, and then I didn't completely leave it behind necessarily, but I moved on to something else. And I've also done some that have to do with like people who've become a lasting part of my own philosophical conversation, all the stuff that's going on in my head, the interests that I've got. So, once I got into Alasdair MacIntyre, I never really left him behind. Same thing with Aristotle, the Stoics, Mary Wollstonecraft, right? And what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit different. It's kind of distinct from those, but it also incorporates those. And it is philosophy understood as a way of life, a way of living. This is a particular orientation to philosophy that has been there really in the West from the start, and I would say in a lot of non-Western philosophy too, it is really centrally important. And for me, as the kind of person that I am, and coming from the background that I have and the interests that I have, it's always been part of how I understood and did and studied philosophy and talked about it and showed interest in it. Now, it's quite striking that in recent years I have become aware, and when I say recent years, like the last decade, of this guy Pierre Hadot and his famous sort of catchphrase philosophy as a way of life. For example, in this very important book, which I have students read, by the way. And, there's other texts that are quite good. Recently, the Selected Writings of Pierre Hadot, following up with this, translated by Matthew Sharp and Federico Testa. Here's another great new book that came out by Matthew Sharp and Michael Ura, Philosophy as a Way of Life, History, Dimensions, Directions. And, when you encounter Hadot, for the most part, I've run into him in terms of people who were interested in Hellenistic philosophy and saying, this is really important. It's not like contemporary analytic or continental philosophy. It was supposed to have a direct application to the way that you live, the way that you not only make decisions, ethical matters, but also aesthetic matters, and to how you organize your household and how you carry out your studies, how you transform yourself as a human being. So I have been, without realizing that it was called Philosophy of Way of Life, I've been doing this my entire career as a student and then teacher of philosophy. And this goes all the way back, officially to 1990, so we're talking 33 years at this point. When I first entered college, I was interested in philosophy already in kind of a haphazard, whatever I could encounter sort of way in high school, and then while I was in the Army, and I would read a lot, but I wasn't reading in any sort of organized way. And I would just pick up, whatever I thought was interesting. I did have 2 philosophy classes that you can read an article about. I'll link to it below. When I was in high school, one was terrible, and that was the official philosophy class. One was really quite helpful, and that was actually a sacraments class that the instructor turned into a philosophy class. So, I never really had the idea of studying philosophy so I could become a college professor. Even when I was in college, what I really wanted to do was to write. And I considered at one point actually dropping philosophy as a major and picking up English, slash writing as a substitute for it. But fortunately, the writing teacher I talked to said, that's a terrible idea. Stick with philosophy. That way you'll have something to write about, And I was, always motivated by the idea of taking philosophy and doing something with it. I'm not going to say I was purely pragmatic, but I definitely wanted, whenever we read a text or, talked about this stuff, to understand, well, what do we do with this? How would the world, if I look at it through the eyes of Immanuel Kant, how does the world look different for me? And how does that affect what I choose, what I commit to, what I refuse, what I get away from? How do I relate to other people? How do I relate to beauty in nature or in movies or music or any of these sorts of things? So for me, philosophy was always something to be studied and also, just as importantly, to live out and experiment with. Now, Pyrrho is not saying that, as some people interpret him, this was something that they did in ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy, and then people lost sight of it and we became a bunch of university professors. I mean, he says that the existentialists are doing philosophy as a way of life in this very book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. I think that this book is particularly good by Matthew Sharp and Michael Ura because it talks about, Socrates and Epicureans and the Stoics, goes through the medievals and early moderns, talks about, Descartes and Francis Bacon and the French Enlightenment, which was lived. It was something that you did, and then, brings up Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Michel Foucault, and what the prospects are for the present. I would say that philosophy as understood as a way of life is much, much broader than even what they're talking about. I'll just give you one prime example. This is the guy I wrote my dissertation on. This is his most important early work, L'Action, 1893, Maurice Blondel. Essai d'une critique de la vie et d'une science de la pratique, which means an essay or, a sort of like attempt at a critique of life and a science of practice. So you've got action, science, life, practice, all of these things connected together. That's what this guy was doing. And he's not unique in that respect, Henri Bergson is paying attention to that. Gabriel Marcel, one of the first people to talk about existentialism in French, right? We could multiply these instances. Etienne Gilson, who Hadot studied with to some degree. We could go on and on and on and on. Philosophy, understood as a way of living, has not been absent even within the universities. You just got to know where to look. You got to know which professors to check out, which authors to read, who the sympathetic ears are, who are the people interested in trying things out and seeing what sort of difference a philosophy makes in our life, offers us. And so the existentialists are great for that. Of course, the American pragmatists and American philosophy in general. Think about Thoreau and Emerson, and going even back further, some of the figures before them, and the intersections between philosophy and literature or drama or history, the humanities in general. They can be an abstract academic thing that we do to write monographs, but they can also be something that is incredibly vital, something that touches us in the core of our being. And that's what philosophy as a way of life really aims at. There's a few other things I need to say about this. One is that there's different names for this sort of thing. Maurice Blondel didn't use the term philosophy as a way of life like Hadot did later. This is philosophy as a way of life. He's talking about the philosophy of action, the method of immanence, the method of implication, a metaphysics of charity and all sorts of things like that. That's philosophy as a way of life. Somebody else who I was very influenced by for a while, Jean-Paul Sartre, his form of existentialism. Philosophy is a way of life right there, And we could go on and on and on. we mentioned Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault doesn't talk about spiritual exercises or philosophy as a way of life. Instead, he talks about technologies of the self. It's the same thing. Alistair McIntyre, coming a little bit later, we'll talk about, from After Virtue onward, tradition-constituted moral inquiry. That's still philosophy as a way of life. And the practices that are involved in that, incredibly important. And philosophy as a way of life can very often involve critique of the prevailing culture that you're within and its products, and thinking about where you're situated within it. That's something from ancient philosophy all the way to the present. McIntyre, before he starts writing things like After Virtue and Whose Justice, Which Rationality, has a lot of culture critique, like Against the Self-Images of the Age. All of that is philosophy understood as a way of life. As a matter of fact, I'll bring up another thinker, somebody I highly recommend, Antonin Sirtillage, a great 20th century Thomist. He has a book called The Intellectual Life, which is essentially philosophy as a way of life. He's a contemporary of Etienne Gilson and Maurice Blondel and all these people, and took part in the Christian philosophy debates with them, where Émile Brehier, the great historian of philosophy, kind of a young punk at the time, said about Maurice Blondel that his work was basically not that philosophical, not like Plato and Aristotle, precisely because, like the Stoics and the Epicureans, it was concerned more with life than with abstract thought. So this idea has been around a long, long time. And if you read attentively authors like René Descartes or Thomas Hobbes, you see them incredibly concerned with how you actually apply philosophy and what its effects are, and how it can transform not just your mind, but your heart and your person. And we see later thinkers, for example, in phenomenology, like Max Scheler, influenced by Augustine, who are doing this sort of thing as well. So there's lots and lots of possibilities for reading philosophy in this way. So that's the first thing I wanted to sort of clarify. Another thing I want to clarify is, philosophy as a way of life is interconnected with history of philosophy. And very often in philosophy in the present, at least in the United States and other places, there is this big contrast between two different ways of doing philosophy. There's analytic philosophy, then there's continental philosophy. And anybody who's read widely enough knows that this supposed analytic continental divide is just a little tiny bit of the vast world of philosophy that's out there. So, there's not only a tertium quid, a third possibility, there's a, fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a seventh, and we could go on and on and on. And where do you find a lot of these? Well, in the history of philosophy. So, you can take a figure who's in, the continental side like Nietzsche, and you can get away from the weird, wacky, trendy stuff and say, I just want to read Nietzsche and see what the hell this guy actually has to say, and whether it's all BS or whether it's applicable to my own life and my relations with other people and my connection to the culture. And now you're doing philosophy as a way of life. You might also be doing history of philosophy, thinking, okay, how did Nietzsche's thoughts develop? What are they responding to? That's real important. But from the perspective of philosophy as a way of life, you are really interested in how does this change the way that I live? What can I do with this? What kind of life does this turn into for me? And that's really important. And I would say that is a vital part of philosophy, that if your professors or your guides or whoever else tells you to ignore, that's not for you, they're full of crap. This is what makes philosophy something so vital and awesome for us, the fact that we can actually take so many great thinkers that we have in this long history of philosophy and get ourselves into a kind of communication with them and say, this is worth thinking about. How do I do something with this? In a certain sense, we're all experimenting. We're all pragmatists in a certain sense. We're all trying to see, we're empiricists. We're seeing what can we actually do with this stuff. And it could be somebody who's very rationalist, like Rene Descartes. If you read Descartes right, and you take to heart some of the things that he's saying, he can change your life. He can change your mindset. And you might not necessarily buy into everything, but you can certainly take what's useful for you and get a lot of mileage out of it. So this is something well worth thinking about. I do want to mention a little bit about my own path with this. And, as I said at the start, I've always looked at philosophy in this way, even before I knew this was a thing. And I will say that not everybody I've run across has been receptive to this. Sometimes you get accused of popularizing or dumbing down philosophy because you're looking at it in this sort of way, or pandering to the masses. What you're doing isn't real philosophy. But, you can just kind of ignore that, because no matter what position you take, no matter who you're studying, there's going to be some jerk who probably is envious of you or doesn't understand you and is going to give you a hard time, right? So don't worry so much about that, I would say, as advice. I would like to say something about the path that I took that wound up with me doing philosophy as a way of life, or understood as a way of living. And as I remarked, I've been doing this really since the beginning, when I formally started studying philosophy as an undergraduate along with mathematics in 1990, so 33 years ago. And, coming from the background that I did, where, there's not a lot of academics in my family, there are some people in professional life, we always wanted to know what you can do with ideas. And, I kind of resisted that. There was this reductionism of, what's your actual product? Why do you think people will pay you to study and do philosophy? And, I'm not trying to reduce it to just that, but I always did want to know, well, what would you do with this? How do you live your life as a person interested in philosophy? How do you apply this kind of stuff within the scope of your relationships, the workplace, your connection to the rest of the world, your understanding of yourself and your development? So, I mentioned that I had some philosophy in high school, and then, I studied a little bit while I was in the Army, and then I became a philosophy major. And the place where I went to school, the professors were near the end of their career, not particularly interested in learning about what the philosophical landscape was like moving into the 90s. They had some kind of weird ideas about, analytic philosophy is just ordinary language philosophy and logical positivism. That stuff's going to die out soon anyway. And, in continental philosophy, it was Marxism and existentialism were the big thing. And then, they thought that classical American pragmatism and process philosophy were big stuff too. And, if you know anything about the history of philosophy, you know that process philosophy was kind of dead in the water by then, and pragmatism was, becoming more and more of a specialty, right? Not a lot of people engaging in that except at certain places, like where I went to graduate school, Southern Illinois University. And so while I was in undergraduate, there was a lot of, my studying things on my own, for instance, really getting into Sartre and other existentialists. I was very into philosophy and its intersection with mathematics, not just in logic, but in, philosophy of mathematics and what you could model. And, that was about application as well. And I got into philosophy of language, in part because I was interested in languages and I wanted to know how they worked and what the prospects for them were. And so, then I came out of undergrad and I worked for a year, worked on my languages, studied quite a lot, and then went to graduate school at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And while I was there, I got introduced to a whole wide world. It was a pluralistic department, so that meant there were analytic philosophers, continental philosophers, classical American philosophers, a few people interested in the history of philosophy. You could go and study rhetoric with the English people. You could go to the classics departments and work on your languages, as I did. I studied Greek with them and also learned Latin on my own. And all of that, at first I was very, very interested in language and anybody doing philosophy of language. So a lot of continental, a lot of analytic philosophy. And then that opened up the door for me to, study and read philosophers in their original languages, at least if they were in, French, which I already had, German, Latin, or Greek. And so I began studying ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy. And, of course, reading Descartes, I read him in Greek and in Latin. And same thing with Leibniz, and, read Hegel in German and Nietzsche in German and Heidegger in German. And so I gathered an appreciation for what it was that these great philosophers were putting in front of us, not just as something for us to engage purely abstractly, but something for us to sort out our own lives in relation to. And that was kind of a big thing at Southern Illinois University that I really appreciate. Now, when I left, by the way, I did my dissertation, as I mentioned, on Blondel, right? So very much concerned with ethical issues and with action. When I left, my very first teaching position was at Indiana State Prison, teaching for Ball State University. And these inmate students were very interested, not just in philosophy as something to study and enjoy and have some, intellectual engagement with, but what would this do for them? What could it say about their own lives, their existence, the day-to-day struggles that they went through, their attempts to make sense of who they were and their relationships and the world that they were living in, and how they would change themselves for the better, or if they even needed to or wanted to. And so some of them responded to different authors, That's where, through their eyes and their voices, I got reinforced for myself how important philosophy, understood as a way of living, could actually be. And so this is, quite important for me. I developed a lot on my part, and I hope that they developed through my classes as well. And then, my next teaching job after the prison job ended was at Fayetteville State University, a historically black university in North Carolina. And there I was teaching critical thinking classes, and there was a lot of this is actually going to be important for you to think about how to be a good citizen, how to be a good consumer, how to not get screwed over by people. But I also got to teach a few philosophy classes. So I taught an intro class that was oriented towards love and friendship and desire. I taught an African American philosophy class as part of a learning community. And that was really quite interesting and good development stuff for me. And then, I did a lot of sort of hands-on, here's how people learn. Let's figure out how to make the classes better for my students. Then I went on to Marist College, where I was an adjunct, and I've adjuncted at several other places. And I will say, just to bring this to a close, I don't want this to get overly long, that in my classes and in my commitments with, presentations and consulting and clients, I'm always interested in, what do you actually do with philosophy, with these philosophers, with these ideas, these systems? How can you use this stuff? How can you incorporate this? What kind of life will this lead to? Or how will it change your life studying it? And I think I managed to communicate that to a lot of my students, and that's part of what made my classes worthwhile and interesting for them. This is what they tell me in like teaching evaluations, or they write me 5 years later and they're like, hey, I actually used this idea from your class. I just wanted to let you know. And I think that's really important. I'm not saying that's the only way to do philosophy. I think that it's perfectly fine for there to be specialists who are just, doing history of philosophy over here, uninterested in what application it would have or be or anything like that. And I think it's fine for there to be people doing, analytic and continental philosophy in ways that may feel like they're applied, but actually aren't. I mean, not to knock it, there are quite a few people in those fields who are doing some really great work on, key issues. But I think that we do need space for this vital dimension of philosophy understood as contributing to our lives, as a guidance for our lives, as offering us tools and insights and exercises and perspectives, and perhaps even, narratives on the part of philosophers about their own experience and their own growth. And we need to have dialogue about this. So you can tell I'm, pretty committed to this. This is something I've been thinking about for quite a long time. And, if you're inclined in that way, that's part of why you study philosophy, or you might even be considering studying philosophy. I'll end by just saying this. There is an incredibly rich world out there awaiting you for you to study that I think you would do quite well to engage with. And, if you want to read people like Pierre Hadot, more power to you. But you can do philosophy as a way of life without ever encountering him as well. So that's all that I have to say about this. It's already quite a lot. And hopefully this has been, if not helpful for you or, enlightening for you, at least interesting and possibly entertaining.